Welcome to our channel, where ordinary stories become extraordinary, not because of magic, but because of courage, kindness, and the unwavering spirit to stand up against injustice. If you enjoy heartfelt stories, rich with meaning, and filled with powerful messages about justice, neighborhood bonds, and the strength of community, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a single story. And now, join us as we follow the journey of an ordinary man who did something truly extraordinary to change his entire neighborhood. Our story begins on what seemed like a peaceful morning in Brookdale Ridge. For over 20 years, Thomas Reed had called Brookdale Ridge home, a quiet suburban neighborhood nestled among the green hills of Northern Virginia. It was a haven for introverts, where every house had a flower-filled front porch, where people knew each other by name, and where children could play freely in the streets without worry. A retired Marine, Thomas understood the value of peace, and he protected it with the same discipline and honor that had carried him through the battlefield. His corner house, with its white-painted wooden fence and perfectly manicured lawn, wasn't just a place to live. It was a reflection of a life lived with integrity. But all of that began to change on one deceptively sunny Saturday morning. A massive black pickup truck suddenly appeared, parked across his driveway like a cold wall of steel. At first, Thomas assumed it belonged to movers helping the new neighbor settle in. True to his warm nature, he stepped outside with a welcoming smile and raised his hand in greeting. "Welcome to Brookdale Ridge. I'm Thomas. I live right across the street." The man, busy hauling boxes, barely glanced up and muttered, "Yeah, thanks." No eye contact, no smile, no handshake. And when Thomas gently pointed out that the truck was blocking his driveway, the man, Derek Lawson, shrugged and said, "I'm busy. I'll move it later." Then he turned his back and carried on as if Thomas didn't exist. The discomfort began right there, creeping in like a shadow. Still, Thomas tried to stay optimistic. But when night fell and the truck remained unmoved, it felt like an unspoken challenge. The next morning, Thomas had to reverse his car inch by inch to make it out in time for church, marking the first time in decades he'd ever arrived late. He tried to brush it off as carelessness, maybe even forgetfulness. But the same scene played out again and again. And each time, Derek responded with the same dismissive shrug and the same tired phrase, "Relax, it's not a big deal." But Derek wasn't just negligent, he was territorial. He began acting as if the entire street belonged to him. Music blasted through the night. Empty beer cans littered Thomas's lawn. Children were yelled at for playing too close to Derek's property. But the worst part for Thomas wasn't the noise or the mess. It was the constant gnawing feeling that his personal space, his sanctuary, was no longer respected. Then came the morning that changed everything. Trying to squeeze past Derek's truck once more, Thomas's car scraped against the streetlight. He stepped out and stared at the long scratch on the paint he'd taken years to maintain. He didn't curse. He didn't yell. But inside, something had shifted. His patience, quiet, disciplined, and long held, had run out. What should have been a minor inconvenience in daily life, a scratch on his well-maintained car, felt to Thomas like the final straw. It wasn't just about parking anymore. It was an unmistakable sign of blatant disrespect for someone else's rights. That evening, as music from Derek's house pounded through the walls like hammers against his temples, Thomas realized he could no longer stay silent. But as a former Marine, he also knew that no battle was ever won on rage alone. It required strategy. Early the next morning, Thomas carefully wrote a note, calm but firm. "Hi Derek, please don't block my driveway again. I kindly ask that you respect other people's space. Thank you. Thomas." He slipped the note under the windshield wiper of the black pickup and walked back home, exhaling slowly, hoping that directness would bring resolution. But by afternoon, when he stepped outside to check, his heart sank. The note had been crumpled and tossed on the hood. Written across it in thick black marker were two words, "My street." Thomas's blood boiled. This wasn't ignorance. It was provocation, a declaration of territorial dominance, a direct challenge to everything Brookdale Ridge stood for, a neighborhood once known for courtesy and mutual respect. His wife, Ellen, stood in the doorway, concern in her eyes. "Maybe it's time to call the police," she said gently. Thomas nodded. He hadn't wanted to cause a scene, but now it was clear. Outside intervention was necessary. 2 officers arrived shortly afterward, their flashing blue lights casting long shadows across the otherwise quiet street. They surveyed the scene, listened to Thomas's account, then knocked on Derek's door. Derek emerged, arms crossed, wearing a smirk of disdain. "It's the old guy again. He's always making a big deal out of nothing," Derek scoffed, jerking a thumb toward Thomas. "I'm not breaking any laws." And in truth, one of the officers admitted that the local parking regulations were vague. All they could do was issue a verbal warning. They had no grounds to ticket or tow the vehicle. As the patrol car drove away, Derek turned back toward Thomas with a mocking glare. "Try again, old man. Let's see what you can do." Then he slammed his door shut. That night, Thomas sat alone in his dimly lit living room, the TV flickering soundlessly as Derek's thumping music continued across the street. He had never felt more powerless, ignored and disrespected on the very land he had worked so hard to preserve. But instead of reacting with fury, Thomas chose another path. Quietly, he opened his laptop and began researching home security systems. If Derek thought Thomas would give up easily, he was wrong, because Thomas knew this battle was only just beginning. The next morning, soft sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, but it did little to ease the fire still burning in Thomas's chest. He sat silently with a cup of coffee in hand, his gaze fixed on the driveway, where the black pickup truck still sat, brazenly blocking his exit, standing like a monument to defiance. No more hesitation. Thomas reached into the drawer, pulled out an old notebook, and began drafting a plan, not one born of impulse or anger, but of evidence and persistence. That very day, he drove several miles to a security equipment store. After careful research, he purchased a surveillance system with wide-angle lenses, night vision, and smartphone connectivity. Later that afternoon, his daughter, Sophie, a second-year engineering student, happened to drop by for a visit. After listening to his story, she rolled up her sleeves without hesitation. "We're not letting this slide," she said, eyes reflecting the same quiet determination that had always defined her father. Together, they installed each camera strategically, covering every corner of the property, front, back, and both sides. Within just a few days, the hard drive began filling up with damning footage. Derek blocking the driveway, blasting loud music late at night, tossing trash into Thomas's yard, and even spitting on the ground in front of his doorstep. Thomas also began keeping a detailed log, timestamps, incidents, and all his polite but failed attempts to reason with Derek. Each entry was documented as carefully as if preparing for a court case, but he didn't stop there. Thomas went online and began researching municipal codes for Brookdale Ridge. Although the parking laws were vague, he discovered one key point. Erecting unauthorized barriers on public access ways was a clear violation. He printed out the regulations and highlighted every relevant section. So when Derek installed 2 metal posts and a bold sign reading "No trespassing" right at the edge of Thomas's driveway, Thomas didn't get angry. He smiled, because now he had the law on his side. Alongside his personal efforts, Thomas began drafting a formal complaint to the local city council. Every word was measured but resolute. "I have no desire to escalate conflict," he wrote, "but if one resident is allowed to commandeer public space and threaten the peace of our neighborhood without consequence, it sets a dangerous precedent for everyone." The day he submitted the complaint was the same day Thomas realized he wasn't fighting alone anymore. As he was mounting a new camera near the fence, an elderly neighbor, Mr. Curtis, walked over quietly and said, "I've seen everything, Thomas. If you need a witness, I'm here." Thomas turned, locking eyes with the man who, like him, had been silent for too long. And in that moment, he understood. This was no longer a personal battle. It had become a civic duty, a stand for what's right. When Thomas finished installing the last camera and activated the auto recording system, he felt something shift in the air around him. It wasn't relief exactly, but it was the undeniable sense that he was no longer fighting this battle alone. Mr. Curtis's unexpected support had opened his eyes. In the silence, many others had been suffering too. They just needed one person to take the first step, one spark to ignite a collective stand. That evening, Thomas made a decision. He would go door to door throughout Brookdale Ridge. Holding copies of the formal complaint and several photos of Derek's illegal barricades, he knocked on each neighbor's door, not with anger, but with sincerity and quiet resolve. "I'm not here to stir up conflict," he told each resident. "I just want to ask, have you had similar experiences with Derek? And if so, would you be willing to stand with me to protect the peace we all share?" What he received in return wasn't just agreement, it was the release of pent-up frustration. Mrs. Lena, who lived 3 houses down, shared that Derek had once yelled at her grandkids just for kicking a ball near his curb. Mr. Murphy, a retired firefighter, grumbled, "That guy backed into my mailbox and didn't even apologize." Jasmine, a single mother of 2, explained how her kids lost sleep every weekend because of Derek's late-night parties. By nightfall, Thomas's living room had transformed into a quiet assembly of those who had once remained silent. Sofas, wooden chairs, even old plastic ones from the shed were brought out. The atmosphere was tense at first, but within minutes, shared stories created an unspoken bond. Thomas opened his laptop and began playing video clips, each one capturing Derek's repeated offenses. There was no narration, but the images spoke volumes: arrogance, disregard, and a pattern of behavior that had gone on far too long. "We're not just victims," Thomas said, his voice steady and clear. "We're witnesses, and now we're a united front." Nods of agreement rippled through the room, eyes sharpened with resolve. Mr. Curtis slowly rose to his feet, his presence commanding. "I used to be an attorney. If everyone agrees, I'll help draft a new complaint, this time from the entire community. Something thorough, professional, and far more powerful than a single voice." Applause followed, not loud, but heartfelt. A strange, beautiful feeling spread among them, the feeling of being seen, of being heard. And in that moment, Thomas knew he had struck the right chord. This wasn't just his story anymore. It had become Brookdale Ridge's journey to reclaim the justice that had been stolen from them. That morning, the skies over Virginia were unusually clear, but Thomas's mind was clouded with uncertainty. Standing before the mirror, he adjusted his shirt collar and tightened his tie. The same hands that had once gripped rifles in foreign lands now trembled slightly at the thought of a civil courtroom. Ellen walked over, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. "You're not just standing up for yourself. You're standing up for all of Brookdale Ridge." Her words settled him like a calming wind. Thomas nodded, picked up the leather case filled with weeks of carefully compiled evidence, and headed out the door. The county courthouse stood 10 miles from their neighborhood, an imposing building of granite steps and towering domes that demanded quiet reverence. Thomas didn't walk in alone. By his side was Mr. Curtis, sharply dressed in a suit pressed the night before, like a comrade stepping onto a new kind of battlefield. Behind them followed more than a dozen Brookdale Ridge residents, each one with a unique story, but united under the same purpose. Derek arrived 5 minutes late. He sauntered into the courtroom, hands in pockets, wearing his trademark smirk. While Thomas and his neighbors were neatly dressed and composed, Derek showed up in a wrinkled polo shirt and dusty sneakers. His lawyer, a weary-looking middle-aged man, opened by brushing the case aside, calling it a collection of petty complaints, and claiming there were no substantial violations worth the court's time. But when Mr. Curtis rose to speak, the tone shifted. With a voice both deep and dignified, he began to present the evidence: photographs of the barricades, videos of Derek's truck blocking driveways, footage of illegal private property signs, blaring nighttime music, and statements from affected neighbors. Piece by piece, a clear and troubling picture emerged, not of a neighborly dispute, but of sustained, disruptive behavior that had impacted an entire community. Derek began to unravel. He sprang to his feet and jabbed a finger in Thomas's direction. "He just wants to humiliate me. I didn't hurt anyone. Everyone's making a big deal out of nothing." But the judge, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, raised her hand and cut him off. "You will have your chance to speak, Mr. Lawson," she said firmly. "This is a courtroom, not a shouting match." After nearly 3 hours of testimony, the judge issued her ruling. Derek Lawson was ordered to remove all unauthorized barricades, cease parking in front of others' driveways, pay fines for municipal violations, and compensate Thomas for legal expenses. A brief silence fell over the courtroom before soft murmurs of relief and quiet approval rippled through the spectators behind Thomas. Derek stood frozen, his smirk wiped clean. He muttered a feeble, "I'll appeal," but even his voice sounded hollow. Everyone in the room knew it was over. He had no ground left to stand on, no support, no excuse. The morning after the court hearing, Thomas stepped out onto his front porch and froze. For a brief moment, he just stood there, taking in what had changed. The black pickup truck, once parked defiantly across his driveway like a bold declaration, was gone. In its place was open, unobstructed space, bathed in soft golden sunlight. The scent of freshly sawed wood hung in the air, accompanied by the sharp clatter of bricks being torn down across the street. Derek, head lowered, was quietly dismantling the unauthorized barricade he had once built like a personal fortress. There were no smug shrugs now, no half smiles, just a man, silently retreating, forced to make things right. Not because of one complaint, but because an entire community had stood together. The sound of bricks hitting the pavement was more than noise. It was the rhythm of a neighborhood being freed from a burden it had carried for months. Over the following week, the atmosphere in Brookdale Ridge changed noticeably. The loud music that once kept children up at night disappeared. Sidewalks that had been claimed were returned to public use. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact now exchanged smiles, waves, and even stopped to chat. It was as if the act of standing together for something just had bound them in a way years of quiet cohabitation never could. That Sunday afternoon, Thomas was invited to the first meeting of a newly formed neighborhood committee, a voluntary group dedicated to resolving disputes peacefully before they ever reached a legal level. The meeting was held right in his living room. The smell of fresh-baked pastries filled the air, children's laughter rang from outside, and the adults around the table wore expressions of seriousness, tempered by goodwill. "We don't want Brookdale Ridge to become some rigid, over-regulated place," Mr. Curtis began. "We want it to be a place where everyone feels heard and respected. From now on, if something's wrong, we talk it out. No need for cameras, no need for courtrooms." Thomas sat quietly, listening to the ideas being shared. He didn't speak much, but something warm stirred in his chest. When one of the neighbors handed him a small envelope, he opened it to find a simple thank you card signed by every person in the room. The handwriting was shaky, but sincere. "Thank you, Thomas Reed, for showing us that refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice can be an act of kindness." That evening, Thomas sat alone on his old rocking chair, a soft breeze brushing against his face as the distant sounds of the nearby lake echoed through the quiet. For the first time in weeks, he smiled. Not because he had won in court, but because he had helped awaken something deeper, the most important thing any community can have: organized kindness. In the days that followed, Brookdale Ridge slowly returned to its usual rhythm, peaceful, polite, and filled with quiet warmth. But for those who had stood with Thomas through the ordeal, the neighborhood was no longer just a place to live. It had become a symbol of something greater, a community that had chosen to stand up for one another, to confront injustice not with rage, but with unity and reason. People no longer referred to him simply as Thomas Reed. Now they called him with affection, the keeper of Brookdale's flame. One afternoon, as Thomas was organizing some old documents in his study, Ellen walked in holding a cream-colored envelope. "A letter from the neighborhood committee," she smiled. Thomas opened it. Inside was a handwritten note and a small framed photo. The picture showed all his neighbors standing in front of his home, smiling brightly. The letter that accompanied it was simple but deeply moving. "To Mr. Thomas Reed, thank you for reminding us that silence in the face of injustice is its accomplice. Thank you for your courage, for never giving up, and for bringing us closer together than ever before." Thomas's eyes blurred as he read the final line. "Because of what you've done, Brookdale Ridge is better today than it was yesterday." He gently placed the photo on a wooden shelf, right next to his military medals, family pictures, and an old letter from a fellow Marine. It stood as living proof that battles for what's right don't only take place on distant fields, but right here in the everyday corners of life, where decency must sometimes be defended with quiet bravery. That evening, Thomas settled once again into his old rocking chair on the porch. A soft spring breeze rustled the porch eaves, carrying with it the sound of children laughing down the street. A dog barked, a bicycle bell rang, neighbors chatted as they tended to their gardens. It was a familiar harmony, the soundtrack of a neighborhood that had nearly been drowned out by one man's selfishness. He glanced across the street. Derek's house was quiet now. Though he no longer caused trouble, Thomas felt no sense of triumph. There was something different in Derek's eyes lately. No longer defiant, but unsure. Maybe, just maybe, it was Thomas's steady, disciplined kindness, not retaliation, that had begun to shift something within him. Thomas's story wasn't a loud tale of heroism. It was a quiet, powerful reminder. Sometimes, to make change happen, you don't need an army. You just need one person brave enough to stand, and others will follow. And so, on the gentle slopes of Brookdale Ridge, a small neighborhood had rediscovered how to protect its peace, not with fences, but with a spirit that would never bow to what's wrong. Life is full of small conflicts, but some seemingly minor disputes can reveal much deeper values, like respect, personal boundaries, and a sense of community. The story of Thomas Reed is not just about a neighborhood argument. It's a living example of perseverance, calm resolve, and the refusal to surrender to what's wrong. In today's world, where so many people choose to stay silent to keep the peace, Thomas chose to stand up, not with anger or aggression, but with clarity, consistency, and deliberate action over time. He took notes, recorded video, studied the law, and rallied his community to act. In the end, he didn't just protect his own rights. He sparked a meaningful change that benefited the entire neighborhood. The first lesson from his story is this: silence is not always the solution, especially when it means allowing wrongdoing to continue. We cannot expect a just society if we turn our backs on justice. Whether you live in a small suburb, a high-rise building, or any type of community, speaking up at the right time might be the only thing needed to ignite real change. Second, this story highlights the power of unity. One person may be ignored or dismissed, but a community, speaking as one, becomes impossible to overlook. Thomas didn't win because he shouted louder than Derek. He won because he made others feel safe to step out of the shadows and take a stand for a shared purpose. And finally, perhaps the deepest message is this: justice is not a privilege, it's a right, owed to every person regardless of age, background, or status. But to protect that right, sometimes we must be willing to do the hard thing, to persist, to confront, and to choose kindness even in an unfair world. Let the spirit of Thomas Reed guide you in everyday situations. When you see someone being bullied, when you witness injustice in the workplace, or when you feel your own dignity is being overlooked. We don't need to be heroes. We just need to refuse to look away. Because sometimes, you are the one person whose courage can inspire an entire community to act. If the story of Thomas Reed moved you, if you've ever witnessed injustice, or been the one whose rights were dismissed simply because someone thought you couldn't do anything about it, know this: you are not alone. The journey to reclaim respect isn't always loud, but it always demands courage. Thomas didn't scream. He didn't retaliate. He simply stood his ground, one step at a time, and refused to back down. So, if you believe that justice is still worth fighting for, through action, through unity, then please support us by liking this video, sharing it with someone who needs encouragement not to give up, and subscribing to our channel to help spread more stories of everyday courage and quiet strength. Because sometimes, a single click from you is a powerful act of standing on the side of what's right.